Hello and welcome to everyone. Good afternoon, and to those folks joining us from the West Coast, good morning. My name is Natasha Berman, and I am the Senior Director of Donor Relations at Conservation International. I would like to thank you for joining our Emerald Circle webinar and for your generous support of CI. It's donors like you who make our work possible, and we're very grateful for your commitment to conservation. I'm so glad you're joining us for our Emerald Circle webinar. We have an exciting topic and speaker that I'm thrilled to introduce in a moment. But first, a few housekeeping logistical items. The audio for today's webinar is through your computer or the device you're using to stream. You can adjust the volume through your device as needed. We'll be using the built-in questions feature today, so you should see a box on the right-hand side of your screen that says questions, and you can use this to add your questions and comments, and we'll save time at the end to answer them. If for some reason we aren't able to answer all of your questions or we don't get to them, we'll be certain to follow up. But again, please chat us with your questions or comments and we'll be happy to address them. Finally, we do record these presentations and we plan to send out a link in follow-up so that you can watch the recording or share it with others later. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker for today's webinar on Force for Nature, Empowering Women to Address Climate Change. Kame Westerman advances gender equity, human rights, and women's leadership in conservation initiatives. As CI's Gender and Conservation Advisor, Kame works across projects and programs to promote practical and culturally appropriate ways to integrate gender considerations into field and policy initiatives. Kame pioneered the organization's gender program, a cornerstone of CI's rights-based approach, and has established CI as a leader in gender-integrated conservation. Today, Kame will share CI's work in gender and conservation at all levels, from the Paris Climate Agreement to our work on the ground to ensure that climate change solutions account for the differences in women's and men's experiences, needs, and concerns. So now I'm very pleased to turn it over to Kame.
Thank you, Natasha, and thank you to everyone who's joining us today. I'm really happy to be here and talking about this important topic. So today, in this webinar, we're going to discuss how women are uniquely impacted by climate change, how women can and do play critical roles in responding to those impacts, and how measures in climate change policy, practice, and funding are being developed to respond. So I want to first start off with a personal story about how I became interested in gender and conservation. As Natasha mentioned, I've spent a lot of time in very rural Madagascar, off the coast of Africa. And in that role as a conservation manager, I worked very closely with local communities who rely very, very heavily on local natural resources. This picture here is from the southwest coast of Madagascar on the Mozambique Channel. And while I was here, I was working very closely with community members on octopus fishery conservation. So octopus in this area is very important for the local economy. It's eaten both within the household and then sold on the market. And I was working with community leaders on best management practices for the octopus fishery. And one day I sort of looked around the room and I realized that nearly everyone in the room was a man. And there were a couple women in the back of the room, but they all had young children with them, and were not fully engaged in the discussion. And in fact, when we asked them questions, they didn't even want to respond to the large group. And this struck me as rather odd because we were, making decisions about the octopus fishery, which, as you can see from this photograph, is very important to women's livelihoods. In fact, in this region, women were the primary harvesters of octopus, while men would tend to go out farther into deeper water and harvest fish. And so, we were making decisions, the men in these communities were making decisions about this fishery without the input of women fishers. And what we came to find out after we asked some questions, started asking questions in the communities, was that women were actually finding that their livelihoods were negatively impacted by some of these conservation initiatives because they were not part of the decision making, because they were not part of the management practices. So to me, that was really my wake-up call in understanding and recognizing how important it is to make sure that the people who are really impacted by conservation initiatives are in the room, that their voices are being heard, and that their needs and priorities are taken into account. So let me first start off with why we're talking about women. So we know that people who are the most vulnerable in society, those in poverty, those with heavy reliance on natural resources, those who have restricted access to information or to resources, are the most impacted by climate change. And this is often women. At the same time, we also know that climate change adaptation and mitigation initiatives will impact men and women differently because of the roles we play in natural resource use. And finally, because of those different roles, women have unique knowledge that is necessary to effectively respond to climate change. So let me give a couple examples to illustrate what I mean here. The first one is water and fuel wood. So, these are two resources that women and girls are primarily responsible for gathering throughout the world. In fact, women and girls can spend up to 5 hours per day collecting water and fuel wood, and this is exacerbated by climate change, the availability of these resources. This also has tremendous impacts on time availability. So we see in areas where there's drought that girls are pulled out of school more frequently. It also means that women are unable to participate in other activities, such as income generation, when they're spending up to 5 hours a day collecting water and fuel wood. And like I said, climate change is already disrupting the availability of these resources and increasing time needed for collection. Because of their role in collecting fuel wood and cooking for families, women and girls are heavily impacted by forest use restrictions that may be developed to protect some of our forests. So for example, through protected areas. There are many examples of failed forest protection initiatives because there are no alternative fuel sources and women are forced to illegally harvest wood. And then finally, because of their role in gathering water and fuel wood, women and girls have unique and important knowledge about the availability and the changes in water and fuel wood sources that can be beneficial. So for example, if we were going to develop a project around watershed management and really wanting to know where the best water sources are, women are probably going to be a really good source of that information. Another thing I wanted to highlight is food, and particularly agriculture here. So women are primarily responsible for household food provision around the world, and in fact, women farmers make up an estimated 45 to 80% of farmers in developing countries. The land that women tend to farm is usually on smaller areas than men and on more marginal and less desirable soil. Women also have less access to resources to improve their production. So it is estimated that women only receive about 5% of the agricultural extension services available. And this includes information or support on improved land management, access to fertilizers and pesticides or improved seeds, that sort of thing. So because of all of this, women farmers are more vulnerable to climate change impacts than men might be. I also wanted to highlight fisheries, as this is also an important area where women make up a large percentage of harvesters. So women make up nearly half of the labor force in small-scale fisheries. And unlike men, who tend to go out farther into the deep water, women tend to stay in shallow areas. This is because it doesn't require expensive equipment like boats or nets. It doesn't require swimming. They can take their children with them, and it's also just closer to the house and to the responsibilities that women tend to have around the household. So an example of this obviously is my experience that I shared earlier on from Madagascar, where women will harvest octopus on the reef flat. And ability to access this important food source and income source is being impacted by climate change. And we're already seeing this in many parts of the world. Another element I wanted to touch on is access to information and decision-making forums. So generally speaking, women around the world have reduced educational opportunities. This is both, formal education in schools and then informal opportunities as well through, through workshops and things like that. There's also restricted access to decision-making forums about natural resources and about other community decision-making issues. And this can be at the household level, at the community level, at the national level, and even at the international level. So if we look at, for example, the percentage of women who are at that international environmental policy making arena, it's certainly less than it is the percentage of men. And both of these things combined together really leads to a limited knowledge of climate change, what it is, how it's impacting resources, and what opportunities exist for women to increase their resilience to climate change. Finally, I also wanted to just note women's role as caretaker, which is, again, quite common across the developing world. Women are responsible for taking care of children, the elderly, and the sick, and this is being compounded by climate change as we see more and more health impacts from climate change. And studies have also shown that women invest about 90% of their income into their family. This is in contrast to about 35% of men's income invested into their family. So this is just an important piece to remember when we're developing projects and programs and policies that are intended to increase household resilience to climate change through income generation. Thinking about who controls that income, who decides how that income is spent is very important. So all of this culminates in an amplified impact of climate change on women, increasing the burden on women's day-to-day lives because of climate change, and really increased risk from natural disasters. Studies have actually shown that women and children are about 14 times more likely to die from natural disasters, which we know are increasing due to climate change. So I know all of this can sound rather theoretical and very general, and it's important to understand and hear from people who are on the front lines of climate change. And over the years, CI has worked with a number of Indigenous women leaders to tell their stories of what they're seeing and how their lives are being impacted by climate change. And we've created a couple short videos about some of these women, and I encourage you to view them. We'll send out links in a follow-up email. But just quickly, I'll go over a couple of them. The first one is Martha from Tanzania, who discusses the challenges of the pastoralist Maasai people in arid northern Tanzania. And as Martha explains, Maasai women are suffering from climate change so severely because they have to find food for children, find grass for the wheat cattle, and get water. And the water sources are drying up. Another video we have is from Hindu from Chad. Hindu illustrates how drought perpetuated by climate change is affecting the pastoralist herders of Chad. And she explains how critical it is to bring women and men together to combat and adapt to climate change, and the importance of Indigenous traditional knowledge. And Hindu is a great example of how Indigenous women from very rural communities can end up playing very influential roles in climate change policy and action. So she's done a great job of taking her experiences from her local community all the way to international policy forums. And as Hindu eloquently says, climate change is a world challenge. If we want to save the world, we have to do it all together. So again, we'll send out links to these videos at the end, and I do encourage you to watch them. Okay, so what can we do? We need to first acknowledge that women and men do experience climate change differently. And we also need to ensure that the climate change policies, finance, and programming that we're creating are actually responding to those differences. And just to give a couple examples of what that actually looks like from our own CI field programs, I'll first take you to Timor-Leste in the South Pacific near Australia. We worked with our CI program in Timor to do basically a gender analysis of their programming. And what they found was that, the CI field staff were all men, and they had a difficult time interacting with the women in the local communities in which we work. It just isn't culturally appropriate for them to approach the women, and the women didn't feel comfortable speaking with our male staff. At the same time, when we actually started talking to the women in the communities about their interest in natural resources and the knowledge that they had, we found that there were a lot of great opportunities and interest on the part of the women to be more engaged in conservation and in CI's efforts. And so one of the things that we did was identify some women leaders in each of the communities we work in who could be sort of liaisons or pseudo staff members who could help our male staff to communicate and relay messages and engage women in the community more. Another example I want to share is from the Philippines. So in the Philippines, we've been working in a protected area for many, many years, and there was a great opportunity to update the protected area management plan of this area. And in talking with men and women, the indigenous men and women that live within the protected area and on the edge, we found that women hadn't really been consulted directly anyway in the establishment of the protected area. And as a result, the management of the protected area didn't necessarily respond to the needs and the interests and the priorities that women had in that area. And so what we were able to do is to actually integrate new language and new activities within the updated management plan to really be able to respond to some of the things we were hearing from the local women. And then finally, a third example I want to share is from Peru. In Peru, we've been working with indigenous communities for many, many years. And in starting a new project focused on tea production, we wanted to understand a little bit more about the tea production and marketing chain that was happening in this area. So we looked at both coffee and tea. And what was interesting is we found that the introduction of coffee back in, I believe it was the 70s, really actually had a major shift on gender roles within agriculture. So traditionally, indigenous women were responsible for agriculture in this community. But when coffee was introduced, the men were the ones that were trained on how to cultivate it and were given the tools and the knowledge on how to move that forward. And it really displaced the women. They lost their cultural connection to agriculture and their role as the community's major players in agriculture. And it actually had a lot of very detrimental effects on the women. So what we want to do is make sure that that doesn't happen with any sort of project we might do involving tea. So taking a lesson learned from decades ago and applying it to other commodities that CI might be interested in amplifying for local livelihoods. And I think it just demonstrates how complex these issues are, and it's not always as straightforward as just providing more livelihoods, but really understanding who does what and how it's going to impact people's lives. We're also, from the policy and finance arena, we're seeing some changes that are having some pretty impactful effects on conservation and climate change as a whole. So within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC, the parties have noted that principles of gender equality and empowerment of women should be respected, promoted, and considered when addressing climate change. And within the 2015 Paris Agreement, which is nearly the entire globe has agreed to this agreement on climate change, the Paris Agreement reflects the commitment that by parties that adaptation to climate change should be gender responsive. This should have real impacts on national climate change policies and plans as these international conventions and agreements are rolled out at the national level. And then finally, looking at finance, the Green Climate Fund provides large amounts of funding for climate change projects around the world. It really mobilizes the UNFCCC's commitments. And the Green Climate Fund, too, is very committed to gender equality in its projects. So it has a gender policy, has requirements on staffing, on funding, on monitoring and evaluation, and on really seeing benefits for both women and men. So as a very quick example, Conservation International's first GCF funded project is focused on small-scale agriculture in Madagascar and is designed to ensure that both men and women farmers can participate in and benefit from the project's activities. So when both policy and finance have these requirements, it really does drive practice and how climate change projects and programs are designed on the ground. So let's look at what CI is doing quickly. I've shared a little bit already, but CI is well positioned to support these efforts with operations in over 30 country offices around the world, a strong presence in international climate change policy negotiations, and as an agency of the Green Climate Fund. CI's work to empower women and advance gender equality and climate change fall into three main buckets. So at the grassroots level, we're really working to ensure that we are designing and implementing climate change projects to respond to women's unique needs. So I shared several examples from Timor-Leste, from the Philippines and Peru. That's really examples of how we're trying to really understand the gender dynamics that are at play in the regions that we work, and then trying to adapt our projects to respond to those. We are promoting and supporting women's leadership in climate change. So examples are the two Indigenous women that we highlighted, Martha and Hindu. So they were both fellows of Conservation International. We've also supported Indigenous women's groups in the past who work on biodiversity conservation and climate change policy. And then finally, looking at the upper levels, influencing climate change policy and finance using our expertise and experiences. So trying to take those examples and the lessons we're learning from the field to influence how climate change policy and climate change finance are designed. To learn more, I do encourage you to go to our website. The address is at the bottom there, and we'll send this out in an email. We also have a blog series that highlights some of our work, particularly highlighting those field program case study examples like Timor-Leste in the Philippines. And with that, I'm going to wrap up. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I believe we have some time for questions.
Thank you so much, Kame. It was very interesting, and we'll see if we have any questions pop up. We do have one question here. What are the avenues and vehicles that you believe are the most effective to elevate and raise awareness between the connections of climate change and gender?
Thanks. Yeah, so I think I mentioned a couple of those, but the personal stories really seem to resonate with people, and the personal stories such as those from Martha and Hindu, the two Indigenous fellows. I think getting those voices to the right table, to the policy arena, and to the decision-making table are incredibly important, and really cultivating strong leadership of both women and men to influence policy. So people from communities where they're really experiencing climate change and they can talk about it firsthand, I think is the most powerful way, or one of the very powerful ways to really influence how policies are designed.
Great. And just a reminder, if anybody that's tuned into the webinar has questions, you can enter them in the questions box on the right, and we will get them and address them. We do have another question here. Do you think the increased visibility about climate change is also translating into more awareness for women's issues, or not necessarily?
Well, I think climate change is certainly providing some opportunities, maybe unintended opportunities for advancing women's empowerment and gender equality. First of all, just through the climate change policies that are really calling for equality, gender equality as a fundamental aspect to it. It helps to promote the issue at that level. And then you also at the more grassroots level, you're actually seeing a couple interesting things happen. For example, land titling is something that needs to happen for a lot of climate change projects. And so these land titling policies are being revised in many countries, and they're actually allowing for women to be able to own land for the first time ever. And so there are these sort of knock-on opportunities that I don't think anyone really, wasn't planned for, but we're seeing some of these great things come out of climate change.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Kame, for your time today. And thank you all very much for tuning in. If anyone has any other questions, you can see my contact information on this last slide that just appeared. You can feel free to reach out to me by phone or email, and I'd be happy to address them. A special thank you to Kame for sharing this important work with us, and thank you all for connecting and hearing more about our work to empower women and advance gender equality and addressing climate change. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm a resource for you. And as a reminder, this session was recorded, and we plan to send along the recording so you can share it with your friends and your networks. Thank you again for joining, and please stay tuned for an invitation to our next webinar, which will be later this spring, and will highlight some of our on-the-ground work in the field. Thank you all for your wonderful support of Conservation International and for your time today, and I hope you have a wonderful afternoon.